The air inside the house felt wrong. The moment we stepped in, thick and heavy, like it had been holding its breath for years. Dust blanketed every surface, muffling the sound of our footsteps. As we wandered through the dimly lit rooms, the wallpaper, once colorful and vibrant, hung in long, curling strips, revealing warped wooden panels underneath. A faint, sour odor lingered in the air, the kind of smell that gets stuck in your nose and refuses to leave. None of us wanted to admit it, but we were spooked. The house was like a corpse, rotting, hollow, and too quiet. The wind outside rattled the broken windows, sending a low, mournful whistle through the empty halls, and every creak of the floorboards beneath our feet felt too loud, as if we were disturbing something that didn't want to be woken. The living room was the worst. The furniture was still there, an old couch with the stuffing spilling out of its torn seams, a coffee table covered in thick grime, and a television sitting on a crooked stand. It was ancient, the kind of boxy set no one had used in decades, but it was turned toward us like it was waiting for someone to sit down and watch. I couldn't stop staring at it. There was something about the way it sat there, half hidden in the shadows, that made my stomach twist. "Over here," someone called, their voice cutting through the oppressive silence. I turned sharply, my heart pounding, and saw Dylan standing near the doorway to the kitchen. His flashlight beam was aimed at the floor, illuminating the edge of a wooden trapdoor. The paint around it was chipped and faded, and the iron ring set into the wood was thick with rust. I didn't want to go down there. None of us did. But Dylan was already pulling the door open, the old hinges groaning in protest, and the musty metallic scent that poured out made my stomach churn. The beam of his flashlight disappeared into the darkness below, revealing a steep staircase leading into what looked like a basement. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise. We stood there, staring at the open trapdoor, the weight of the house pressing down on us. My hands felt clammy, the flashlight slipping slightly in my grip, and I had to force myself to move forward, to follow Dylan as he started down the stairs. The wood creaked under his weight, each step echoing faintly in the confined space. The basement was colder than the rest of the house, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones and makes your skin crawl. The walls were lined with shelves, most of them empty, but a few still held remnants of the past. Cans of paint, rusted tools, and jars of something unidentifiable. In the corner, under a tattered tarp, was an old chest, its lid slightly ajar. Dylan moved toward it, his flashlight sweeping across the damp concrete floor, and I followed, the others lingering near the stairs. The chest was covered in scratches, deep gouges that looked like they'd been made by something desperate. My chest tightened as Dylan pulled the lid open, revealing what was inside. Tapes. Dozens of them. Old VHS tapes, stacked haphazardly, their labels yellowed and curling. The titles were handwritten, scrawled in jagged letters that were hard to read in the dim light. Dylan reached for one, holding it up to his flashlight, and I saw the name etched across the label. The Family, 1985. The air around us seemed to grow colder, heavier, as though the house itself was watching us. Dylan shrugged, slipping the tape into his bag, and grabbed a few more. None of us said anything. Moved savior, today, ma. We just wanted to get out of there. Back upstairs, the house felt different. The walls seemed closer, the shadows darker, and the faint whistle of the wind had turned into a low, hollow moan. The television in the living room caught my eye again, its dark screen reflecting the faint glow of Dylan's flashlight. It wasn't plugged in, but for a split second, I thought I saw static flickering across the glass. We left in a hurry, the door slamming shut behind us with a force that made me jump. The air outside was crisp and cool, a stark contrast to the stifling heaviness of the house, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd brought something out with us. The tapes sat in Dylan's bag, silent and unassuming, but their presence felt wrong, like they were waiting. Later that night, back at Dylan's place, we gathered in the living room to watch the first tape. He had an old VHS player, something he'd kept around for the novelty, and the machine whirred loudly as it swallowed the tape. The screen flickered to life, the image grainy and distorted, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then, the footage began. It showed a family, 2 parents and 2 kids, standing outside a house that looked eerily familiar. The father was holding a camcorder, his voice cheerful as he narrated. "Here we are, moving into our new home," he said, the sound warbling slightly through the speakers. The kids waved at the camera, their smiles wide and forced, and the mother stood stiffly, her eyes darting toward the house behind them. The tape cut abruptly to the interior of the house, the same living room we'd just been in. The family was unpacking boxes, their movements jerky and unnatural, like something was wrong with the tape. The camera panned to the television, its screen flickering with static, and the father's voice faltered. "I don't remember turning that on," he said, the cheer gone from his tone. "I told you was you, did you?" The mother glanced at the screen, her face pale, and the kids froze, their smiles fading. The tape cut again, this time to the basement. The camera was shaky, the image distorted, but I could see the trapdoor in the corner of the frame, slightly ajar. A sound echoed faintly in the background, a low rhythmic tapping, and the camera moved closer, the lens focusing on the dark opening. The screen went black. We stared at the TV, waiting for the tape to continue. But the only thing that came through the speakers was the faint hiss of static. Then, just as Dylan moved to eject the tape, the screen flickered back to life. The camera was in the living room again, but this time, it wasn't showing the family. It was showing us. The image was grainy but unmistakable. 5 people standing in the same room, staring at the screen. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the angle of the shot was wrong. It wasn't coming from the TV. It was coming from the corner of the room. And from the last behind us, El Tifida Battle War Tooth Bajandel Batiste. The room plunged into a suffocating stillness as we all turned, almost in unison, toward the corner where the angle of the camera must have been. My heart pounded so loudly in my chest, it felt like it might crack my ribs. Holly, the corner was empty, or at least it should have been. The shadows there seemed thicker, darker, like they weren't just the absence of light, but something alive, something watching us. My stomach twisted into knots as the air around me grew colder, biting and unnatural, like the room itself was holding its breath. Dylan hit the eject button on the VHS player, his hand shaking so hard it fumbled against the controls. The machine made a loud, grinding noise, spitting the tape out like it couldn't get rid of it fast enough. He grabbed it and threw it onto the coffee table, the plastic case rattling against the wood. "What the hell was that?" he muttered under his breath, but no one answered. I couldn't. My voice was caught somewhere deep in my throat, buried beneath the suffocating weight of fear. The screen on the TV had gone black, but the faint ghostly glow of the tube remained, casting pale light across the room. I couldn't look away from the corner. It's still a day. 10 tune. I couldn't look away from the corner. I kept waiting for something to move, for the shadows to shift. But they didn't. Or maybe they did, just enough to make me doubt what I was seeing. Hindu, Bauna, I done to move tea. My palms were slick with sweat, and the flashlight I'd been gripping earlier slipped from my hand, clattering to the floor. We should leave, Ellie said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. She was sitting on the edge of the couch, her knees pulled to her chest, her wide eyes darting between us and the tape on the table. We shouldn't have watched it. We shouldn't have gone there. No one's stopping you, Dylan snapped. Though his voice lacked its usual bravado, he wasn't as calm as he wanted us to think. None of us were. I stood, my legs trembling beneath me, and moved toward the coffee table. The tape sat there, innocuous and silent, but it felt wrong, like it was watching us back. I reached for it, my hand hovering over the plastic, and a sharp, static-filled crackle erupted from the television behind me. I spun around, my pulse spiking, and the screen was no longer black. It was filled with static, the grainy, flickering kind that crawled across the screen like ants. The room filled with the faint hum of white noise, and the glow from the screen seemed brighter now, almost pulsating, as though it had a heartbeat of its own. None of us moved. None of us spoke. We just stared, frozen in place, as the static began to shift. At first it was subtle, just faint shapes moving in the background, almost imperceptible, but they became clearer, darker, figures. 4 of them, standing still, their outlines distorted by the static. My breath caught in my throat as I realized they weren't just shadows. They were us. The figures on the screen didn't move, but the way they stood, stiff, unnatural, with their heads slightly tilted, made my skin crawl. My own distorted reflection was the closest, its features warped and stretched by the flickering static, but it was undeniably me. The others were there too, equally still, equally wrong. It was like the screen had taken some corrupted snapshot of us, something broken and incomplete, Then, slowly, the figure that was supposed to be me began to turn its head, turn it off. Ellie hissed, her voice trembling, but no one moved. The figure on the screen tilted its head further, its movements jerky and unnatural, until it was looking directly at us, or, at least, at the camera. Its face was featureless now, blank and hollow, with no eyes or mouth, just a smooth void where a face should have been. The other figures followed, one by one, until all four of them were staring at the camera. The static grew louder, sharper, a piercing sound that made my ears ring and my head ache. I clutched at my temples, the pressure building behind my eyes. And Dylan finally moved. He lunged for the TV, his hand slamming against the power button. But the screen didn't turn off. The static only grew louder, the glow brighter, and the figures on the screen began to move. They stepped closer to the camera, their jerky, unnatural movements sending shivers down my spine. The screen flickered violently, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something else. Another room, another place, with walls that were damp and dark, and a single chair sitting in the center. But the image was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced once more by the static and the figures. Dylan grabbed the VHS player next, yanking it from the wall, the cords snapping loose with a loud crack. The static on the TV didn't stop. Stop. The figures didn't stop. They kept moving closer, their shapes growing larger, darker, until it felt like they were about to step out of the screen entirely. Ellie screamed, and the lights in the room flickered, plunging us into brief moments of total darkness. Each time the light came back, the figures on the screen were closer, their hollow, faceless voids staring directly at us. My breath hitched, my heart hammering in my chest, as the glow from the TV filled the room, swallowing the shadows, swallowing us. And then, everything went dark. The static stopped. Oh, envelop. The leeward suction, the hum, disappeared. The TV screen went black, and the oppressive silence returned, heavier than ever. I could hear Ellie's ragged breathing, Dylan's muttered curses, and the faint creak of the floorboards beneath us. My flashlight flickered back to life, its weak beam cutting through the darkness, and I scanned the room, my pulse still racing. The corner was empty. The tape on the coffee table was gone. Envelop. Audi. A loud thud echoed from somewhere upstairs, followed by the unmistakable sound of something scraping against wood. And the air grew colder, the metallic tang of the house returning, stronger than before. None of us wanted to move, but the sound came again, louder this time, closer. Something was in the house with us. With us. The sound from upstairs was steady and deliberate, each scrape against the wood, dragging out longer than the last. It wasn't like the house settling or the creaks of old floorboards. This was intentional, like someone or something was dragging something heavy just above our heads. The air had grown colder again, sharp and biting, and every breath I took felt like inhaling broken glass. My flashlight trembled in my grip, its weak beam bouncing against the walls as I turned toward the staircase. None of us spoke. None of us moved. The weight of the silence between the noises was almost as oppressive as the sound itself, pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. I could feel Ellie beside me, her shoulders hunched, her breathing shallow and uneven. Dylan stood near the doorway, his jaw clenched, his flashlight beam fixed on the stairs, but wavering like his resolve was crumbling. The sound came again, louder now, closer. Whatever it wasn't trying to hide. The deliberate grinding scrape set my teeth on edge, the noise burrowing into my skull like a living thing. My stomach churned, bile rising in my throat as the weight of the air around us thickened, pushing down harder with every passing second. And then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was total, absolute, and it rang in my ears, making my heart pound in the sudden stillness. My flashlight flickered weakly, the beam struggling against the darkness, and I felt the cold press of fear against my chest, tight and unrelenting. I didn't want to go up there. I didn't want to see what was waiting for us. But the alternative, standing here doing nothing, waiting for it to come to us, felt even worse. "Stay here," Dylan muttered, his voice low and shaky, as he took a step toward the stairs. His flashlight cut a jagged line of light through the shadows, illuminating the warped wood and peeling wallpaper as he moved closer. The stairs groaned under his weight, each step loud and jarring in the suffocating silence. And I could feel Ellie tense beside me, her breath hitching every time the wood creaked. I didn't stay behind. My legs moved before my mind could catch up, dragging me forward, the cold air biting at my skin. As I followed Dylan up the stairs, each step felt heavier than the last, like the house itself didn't want me to move, and the light from my flashlight flickered weakly against the walls, the shadows shifting and curling just out of reach. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I was afraid of what I might see if I did. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out before us, dark and narrow, the walls warped and stained with water damage. The faint smell of mildew mixed with the sharper, metallic tang that seemed to hang in the air like a warning. Confuses, so deep be. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating doorways that gaped open like mouths, the rooms beyond swallowed by shadow. The scraping sound came again, this time from the far end of the hall. It was louder here, closer, and the vibrations rattled through the floorboards beneath my feet, making my legs tremble. Dylan turned toward the noise, his flashlight steady now, and I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his knuckles whitened as he gripped the light tighter. We moved forward together, each step slow and deliberate, the weight of the house pressing down on us with every inch we gained. The sound stopped again as we neared the last door on the left, the one that was slightly ajar. Its frame splintered and warped as though something had forced it open. My heart pounded against my ribs as I reached for the door, my hand trembling as I pushed it open. The room beyond was empty, or at least, it looked empty at first glance. The air was colder here, sharp and biting, and my breath fogged in the faint glow of my flashlight. The walls were bare, the floor covered in a thick layer of dust that muffled our footsteps as we stepped inside. But something was wrong. The room didn't feel empty. It felt alive. My flashlight caught movement in the far corner, just a flicker of something dark and shifting, and my breath caught in my throat as I aimed the beam toward it. At first, I thought it was a shadow, just a trick of the light, the way the beam bounced off the uneven walls. But then it moved again, curling inward, coiling like smoke, and I realized it wasn't a shadow at all. It was watching us. The shape in the corner was impossible to define, its edges blurred and jagged, shifting constantly as though it couldn't decide what form to take. The darkness around it seemed thicker, heavier, pulling at the light from my flashlight, swallowing it before it could reach the center. My stomach twisted, and I felt Ellie's hand grip my arm tightly, her nails digging into my skin. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling, barely audible over the sound of my own breathing. I didn't answer. I couldn't. And the words were stuck in my throat, buried beneath the suffocating weight of the air around us. The thing in the corner didn't move closer, but I could feel it pressing against me, its presence cold and unrelenting, sinking into my skin. My flashlight flickered, the beam dimming, and for a brief moment, the room was plunged into total darkness. When the light came back, the corner was empty. The air was still heavy, thick with something I couldn't name, and the shadows on the walls seemed to ripple faintly, as though they were retreating, pulling back into the edges of the room. The metallic tang in the air grew stronger, sharp and choking, and the floor beneath us groaned, the wood creaking loudly as though something massive was shifting below. "We need to go," Ellie said, her voice sharp, urgent, and I felt her tugging at my arm, pulling me toward the door. My legs felt like lead, my body frozen in place, but I forced myself to move, stumbling backward as Dylan followed, his flashlight still aimed at the empty corner. The hallway felt longer now, the shadows darker, the walls closer, pressing in on us as we moved back toward the stairs. The scraping sound returned, louder this time, more frantic, and I realized, with a sickening twist in my gut, that it wasn't coming from above us anymore. It was coming from below. The scraping grew louder as we reached the top of the stairs, a grating metallic sound that vibrated through the air and made my teeth ache. It wasn't the sound of something aimlessly moving. It was deliberate, like it was trying to draw us closer. The cold intensified, biting through my clothes and sinking deep into my skin. My flashlight flickered again, the beam struggling to stay steady, and I felt Ellie's grip tighten on my arm as we stood frozen at the top of the staircase. The air around us felt alive, heavy with something unseen but undeniably present. My heart pounded against my ribs, each beat echoing in my ears, and I couldn't bring myself to take the first step. The darkness below seemed thicker, darker, like it was waiting to swallow us whole. The scraping stopped suddenly, replaced by a low, guttural sound that vibrated through the floorboards, a sound so deep I could feel it in my chest. Dylan didn't wait. His jaw clenched. He started down the stairs, his flashlight cutting through the shadows. The rest of us hesitated, the silence between each creak of the steps stretching longer than it should have. I glanced back down the hallway, half expecting to see something standing in the doorway of the room we'd just left, but there was nothing, just shadows. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. "Hey, come on," Dylan said from halfway down the stairs, his voice low but firm. See, he didn't turn back to look at us, his focus fixed on whatever lay below. The sound returned, faint and rhythmic now, like a slow heartbeat, and I felt the floor beneath me tremble slightly as the air grew colder still. I took a step forward, then another, my legs trembling with each movement. The stairs groaned under my weight, the sound too loud in the oppressive silence, and Ellie followed closely behind, her breathing shallow and uneven. The darkness at the bottom of the stairs seemed to stretch upward, curling around us as we descended, and by the time we reached the bottom, the light from our flashlights barely seemed to reach the walls. The living room was different now. The air was thicker, heavier, the metallic tang sharper than ever. The furniture sat where we had left it, but it felt wrong, as though it had been rearranged slightly, just enough to be unsettling. The TV was off, its screen dark, but I could feel its presence like a weight in the room, pressing against the edges of my vision. Then the scratching started again. It came from the far corner of the room, faint at first, but growing louder, sharper, as though whatever was making it was dragging something heavy across the floor. My flashlight beam wavered as I turned toward the sound, illuminating the corner where the shadows seemed to shift and writhe. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped closer, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The light caught something. Just a flicker, a movement too quick to be natural, and I froze. The shadows in the corner thickened, curling inward, and I could see something there now, a shape forming out of the darkness. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs long and angular, its edges jagged and shifting like static on an old TV screen. It didn't have a face, just a blank void where features should have been. But I could feel its gaze, cold and piercing, boring into me. Ellie whimpered behind me, and the sound seemed to trigger something. The figure moved, its head tilting sharply to the side, the motion unnatural and jarring. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, and I realized with a sickening jolt that it wasn't coming from the floor anymore. It was coming from inside the walls. The room seemed to breathe, the shadows on the walls rippling like waves as the figure stepped forward, its movements jerky and wrong. The air grew impossibly cold, and I stumbled backward, the flashlight slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. The beam spun wildly, illuminating the room in jagged bursts of light, and I saw it then, the source of the scratching. And Kinaube, these dull, pale and gaunt, their fingers impossibly long, were clawing out of the walls, dragging themselves through the wood, as though the house itself was trying to come alive. The walls groaned, the sound low and guttural as more hands emerged, their nails digging into the floor, the ceiling, the very fabric of the room. The figure in the corner was moving faster now, its jagged form shifting and twisting as though it were made of smoke and glass. "Rune," Dylan shouted, his voice cracking as he grabbed Ellie's arm and pulled her toward the hallway. I stumbled after them, my legs weak and unsteady, the sound of splintering wood and scraping nails following us as we ran. The hallway stretched out before us, impossibly long, the walls narrowing and bending as though the house was closing in around us. My flashlight beam flickered weakly, the light dimming with every step, and I could feel the shadows at my back, reaching for me, pulling at my clothes, my skin, my mind. We burst into the kitchen, the air there no less oppressive, and slammed the door shut behind us. Dylan pushed a heavy wooden table against it, his breathing ragged, and Ellie collapsed into a chair, her face pale and drawn. The walls around us were still trembling, the faint sound of scratching echoing through the room. And I knew it wasn't over. The kitchen felt smaller than before, the ceiling lower, the walls closer, and the shadows in the corners seemed darker, more alive. My flashlight flickered one last time before going out completely, plunging us into near total darkness. The only light came from the faint glow of the moon through the cracked window. But it did little to cut through the suffocating gloom. "Do you hear that?" Ellie whispered, her voice barely audible, and I strained to listen, my heart pounding in the stillness. At first, there was nothing, just the faint creak of the house and the sound of our breathing. But then I heard it, a low, rhythmic thump coming from beneath the floorboards. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, more insistent, and the floor beneath my feet began to vibrate with each impact. Dylan's flashlight flickered back to life, its beam faint and sputtering, and he aimed it at the floor. The wood was buckling, cracks spreading outward like veins, and the sound of splintering timber filled the air as the thumping grew more violent. Ellie screamed, and I stumbled back, my foot catching on something solid, and I fell hard against the wall. The cracks in the floor widened, the dark liquid seeping through in thick, glistening trails, and I realized with a cold, sinking dread that whatever was coming, it wasn't going to stop. The shadows in the room surged forward, curling and twisting, and the rhythmic thumping turned into a deafening roar, shaking the walls, the ceiling, the very air around us. And then, with a sound like tearing fabric, the floor gave way. When the floor gave way, it wasn't like falling, it was like being swallowed. The wood splintered around us with a sickening crack, and the cold, damp air rushed up to meet me as I tumbled into the darkness below. My stomach flipped as the ground disappeared beneath my feet, and for a moment I was weightless, suspended in a void that felt endless. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me and sending sharp pain shooting through my side. The flashlight slipped from my hand and skittered across the uneven surface, its weak beam flickering erratically. The air down here was colder, wetter, and every breath felt like I was choking on ice. I tried to sit up, my limbs trembling, but the darkness pressed against me, heavy and unrelenting, and my head swam with dizziness. The room, or whatever space we'd fallen into, was impossibly large. The weak light from my flashlight barely illuminated more than a few feet in front of me, but I could feel the emptiness stretching out in all directions. The walls were damp and slick, the air thick with the metallic tang of rust or blood, and the faint rhythmic sound of dripping water echoed faintly through the void. I scrambled toward the flashlight, my hand sliding over the cold, wet ground, and grabbed it just as the beam began to dim. I twisted the light upward, aiming it around the room, but the shadows swallowed it almost instantly. I could see the others scattered across the ground, their movements slow and unsteady, their flashlights casting frantic beams of light through the darkness. "Ellie," I called out, my voice hoarse and trembling, but the sound barely carried in the thick, oppressive air. I crawled toward her, my knees scraping against the rough ground, and found her sitting against the wall, her face pale and streaked with tears. She was clutching her arm, her fingers pressing against a jagged tear in her sleeve, and her flashlight lay shattered a few feet away. "I'm fine," she whispered, though her voice was shaky, her eyes darting toward the shadows. "Where's Dylan?" I turned, sweeping my flashlight around the space, and caught a glimpse of him a few feet away, crouched low, his own flashlight steady in his hand. His face was set, his jaw clenched, but his eyes betrayed his fear. He was staring at something in the distance, his light fixed on a point beyond the reach of my beam, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. The shadows were moving, and moving. Einen Durst. I looked through. It wasn't the way shadows should move. Not a reaction to the light, not a trick of the eye. They were curling inward, coiling like smoke, their edges sharp and jagged, shifting with an unnatural rhythm that made my stomach twist. The sound of the dripping water grew louder, faster, echoing through the space like a heartbeat, and the ground beneath me began to tremble faintly. "We need to move," Dylan said, his voice low and urgent, but his eyes didn't leave the shadows. "It's not going to stay there." "What is it?" Ellie asked, her voice trembling. But Dylan didn't answer. He just stood, his movements slow and deliberate, and motioned for us to follow him. The ground beneath us was uneven, slick with the same dark liquid that seemed to seep from the walls, and every step felt like a struggle. The air grew colder as we moved, sharper, cutting into my lungs with each shallow breath, and the shadows seemed to close in around us, their movements faster, more erratic. My flashlight flickered weakly, the light dimming with each passing second, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread settle over me. Then I saw it. At first, it was just a shape, a darker shadow among the darkness, but as we moved closer, the edges became sharper, more defined. It was massive, its form hunched and jagged, its limbs impossibly long, stretching out into the void. It didn't have a face, just a hollow void where a face should have been. But its presence was overwhelming, suffocating. The air around it rippled, distorting the light, and I felt a cold, heavy weight settle over me, pressing me to the ground. The rhythmic sound of the dripping water stopped, replaced by a low, guttural hum that vibrated through the air, shaking the ground beneath us. The thing didn't move, but I could feel its gaze, cold and unrelenting, fixed on us. My flashlight flickered again, the beam sputtering and fading, and the shadows around us surged forward, curling and twisting, their jagged edges slicing through the air. "Run," Dylan said, his voice sharp and desperate, and I didn't hesitate. My legs felt heavy, my movement sluggish, but I forced myself forward, stumbling through the darkness as the ground trembled beneath me. The shadows followed, their movements chaotic and relentless, and the low hum grew louder, more deafening, filling my ears and drowning out everything else. Ellie was ahead of me, her steps uneven but determined, and Dylan was behind us, his flashlight swinging wildly as he tried to keep the shadows at bay. The air grew colder, wetter, and the metallic tang was so strong now, it made my stomach churn. I could feel the weight of the thing behind us, its presence pressing against my back, and every instinct screamed at me to move faster. The ground beneath us gave way again, the floor splintering with a deafening crack, and I fell, my body slamming hard against another surface below. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and for a moment I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My flashlight had slipped from my hand, the beam extinguished, and the darkness was absolute, suffocating. When I finally managed to sit up, the air around me was different. It was heavier, thicker, and the faint hum had turned into a steady, rhythmic pounding, like a heartbeat. The ground beneath me was warm, pulsing faintly, and as I reached out to steady myself, my hands touched something cold and smooth. It wasn't stone. It wasn't wood. And it felt alive. The pounding grew louder, faster, and the shadows around me began to shift again, curling inward, their jagged edges closing in. I grabbed blindly for my flashlight, my fingers brushing against the cold metal, and flipped the switch. The beam sputtered weakly to life, illuminating the ground beneath me, and I froze. The surface was covered in faces. Twisted, anguished faces, their mouths open in silent screams, their eyes hollow and lifeless. The ground beneath them was slick with the dark liquid pooling in the cracks and crevices, and as the light moved across them, their features seemed to shift, contorting in agony. The pounding stopped, the shadows stilled, and then, from somewhere deep within the darkness, a voice emerged. "You're not supposed to be here." The voice wasn't like anything I had ever heard. It wasn't coming from the shadows, the walls, or even the darkness. It was inside me, reverberating through my chest, echoing in my mind. It was deep and guttural, a low vibration that felt alive, almost organic, as though the lodge itself was speaking. My body froze, paralyzed by the weight of it, and every breath felt sharp and shallow, as if the air had turned into shards of ice. "You don't belong," it growled, the words stretching out, pulling at the edges of my sanity. My flashlight trembled in my hand, the weak beam quivering as I turned it toward the source of the sound. But the light was swallowed almost instantly by the shadows. Ellie was beside me now, her eyes wide, her breathing erratic. I could feel her trembling, her hand gripping my arm so tightly, it felt like she was trying to anchor herself to reality. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, the words breaking apart as they left her lips. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The voice came again, louder this time, sharper, cutting through the suffocating air like a blade. "You took it. You shouldn't have touched it. The tapes." The realization hit me like a cold slap to the face, and my stomach twisted violently as I remembered the tape, sitting in Dylan's bag, the room we'd seen on the screen, the figures watching us, the way the lodge had changed after we watched it. It wasn't just a tape. It was a doorway, and we had opened it. Dylan was behind us, his flashlight steady as he moved toward the shadows, his jaw set in defiance. "Show yourself," he shouted, his voice cracking but determined. The sound echoed through the void, bouncing off the unseen walls. And for a moment, everything was still. Then the ground shifted. It wasn't a tremor or a crack. It was a pulse, a deep, rhythmic vibration that traveled through the floor, into my legs, and up into my chest. The faces beneath us moved, their features twisting in unison, their hollow eyes turning toward us. The liquid pooling around them began to bubble, hissing softly as it rose, and the shadows surged forward, their jagged edges coiling and writhing like a living thing. Dylan's flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering as the darkness closed in around him. "Get back," he shouted, his voice desperate now, but the shadows didn't stop. They moved faster, curling around his legs, his arms pulling him toward the center of the room. "Dylan!" Ellie screamed, and I lunged forward, grabbing for his arm, but the shadows were too strong. They wrapped around him like smoke, their jagged edges slicing through his clothes, his skin, leaving behind deep, dark gashes that didn't bleed. His flashlight fell to the ground, the beam spinning wildly as he disappeared into the void. Ellie collapsed beside me, her sobs breaking the silence, and I turned my flashlight toward the shadows, aiming directly into the mass of darkness where Dylan had been. "Give him back," I shouted, my voice raw, but the words felt small, insignificant, swallowed by the enormity of the thing that surrounded us. The voice returned, quieter now, almost a whisper. "It's already begun. You can't stop it." The liquid beneath us bubbled violently, and the faces in the floor began to dissolve, their features melting into the dark pool like ink in water. The air grew thicker, heavier, and the metallic tang turned acrid, burning my throat with every breath. I grabbed Ellie's arm, pulling her to her feet, and we stumbled toward the faint outline of a doorway at the far end of the room. The floor shifted again, the pulse stronger this time, and the ground cracked beneath our feet, splitting into jagged fissures that radiated outward like spider webs. The shadows surged forward, filling the cracks, reaching for us, and I pushed Ellie ahead of me, my flashlight beam bouncing erratically as we ran. The doorway led to a narrow corridor, its walls damp and slick with the same dark liquid. The air was colder here, almost freezing, and our breath fogged in the faint light as we stumbled forward, the shadows at our heels. My legs ached, my chest burned, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The thing behind us wasn't just chasing us. It was consuming us, pulling us deeper into its world with every step. The corridor opened into another room, larger this time, with a high arched ceiling that disappeared into darkness. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on it sat a single tape, its label yellowed and curling, the words scrawled in jagged, uneven handwriting. The archivist. Ellie froze, her eyes locked on the tape, and I felt the air around us shift, growing colder, heavier, as though the room itself was holding its breath. The shadows stopped at the edges of the room, curling and twisting, their movements erratic, but they didn't enter. It was like they were waiting, watching. "It's a trap," I whispered, but Ellie didn't move. Her eyes were wide, her face pale, and her hand trembled as she reached for the tape. "Don't," I said, my voice shaking. But it was too late. Her fingers brushed to the edge of the tape, and the room exploded with light. The shadows surged forward, their jagged edges slicing through the air, and the ground beneath us trembled violently. The pedestal shattered, the tape falling into Ellie's hands, and the voice returned, louder than ever, echoing through the room with a deafening roar. "You can't escape. You are part of it now." The walls around us cracked and splintered, the liquid rising in thick, churning waves, and the shadows closed in, wrapping around us like a suffocating shroud. My flashlight went out, plunging us into total darkness, and the last thing I heard was Ellie's scream, sharp and desperate, before everything went silent. The darkness wasn't just an absence of light. It was alive, thick and suffocating, pressing against me from all sides. It felt like I was underwater, unable to breathe, unable to move, the weight of it crushing down on me. Ellie's scream echoed in my ears, sharp and raw, before it was swallowed by the void, leaving me alone with the silence. And then, faintly, I heard it, a hum, low and resonant, vibrating through the space around me. It wasn't coming from any one direction. It was everywhere, filling the air, the ground, my chest. The sound grew louder, more insistent, and the darkness began to shift, swirling like smoke caught in an unseen current. The shadows parted, curling back toward the edges of the room, and the faintest sliver of light pierced through the void. I forced myself to move, my limbs heavy and trembling, and turned toward the light. It wasn't much, just a flicker, dim and unsteady. But it was enough to pull me forward. The ground beneath my feet was uneven, slick with the same dark liquid that seemed to cling to everything here, and every step felt like I was dragging myself through mud. My flashlight was gone, lost somewhere in the chaos, but the light ahead grew brighter, guiding me through the oppressive gloom. The hum grew louder as I moved closer, the sound vibrating through my bones, and the air around me grew colder, sharper. The light was coming from another room, its faint glow spilling through a jagged doorway that looked as though it had been torn from the walls themselves. The edges of the doorway were jagged and uneven, the wood splintered and rotting, and beyond it, the source of the light pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat. I stepped through the doorway and stopped. The room was massive, impossibly large, the walls stretching high above into darkness. In the center of the space stood a structure, a monolithic machine made of metal and glass, its surface slick with condensation and streaked with dark, rust-like stains. The light was coming from inside the machine, a faint, flickering glow that pulsed in time with the hum, and I felt a sickening sense of recognition as I stared at it. It looked like the inside of the tapes, the same dim lighting, the same jagged, shifting shapes moving just beyond the edges of the glow. The machine groaned softly, the sound deep and resonant, and I realized the hum wasn't coming from the room. It was coming from the machine itself. Its surface was covered in symbols, etched deep into the metal, the markings shifting and changing as I watched. The air around it felt heavier, thicker, pulling me closer with an invisible force. Ellie was there, standing at the base of the machine, her back to me. Her body was tense, her shoulders hunched, and I could see her hands trembling as she held the tape. The glow from the machine bathed her in faint light, casting jagged shadows across the room, and I could feel the weight of its presence pressing down on both of us. "Ellie," I whispered, my voice trembling, but she didn't turn. She just stood there, staring at the machine, the tape clutched tightly in her hands. The hum grew louder, sharper, and I felt the ground beneath me tremble as the air around us grew colder. "It's showing me," she said finally, her voice low and hollow, as though she was speaking from somewhere far away. "Everything. It's all in here." "What are you talking about?" I took a step closer, my legs trembling, and reached out for her, but the air between us seemed to ripple, pushing me back. "Ellie, we need to leave. We have to get out of here." She turned then, slowly, and the look in her eyes made my blood run cold. They weren't her eyes, not anymore. They were dark and hollow, like the void I'd seen in the figures on the tapes, and her face was pale, almost translucent, the veins beneath her skin faintly visible in the dim light. She held the tape out toward me, her movements jerky and unnatural, and I stumbled back as the hum grew louder, deafening. "It's not just recording," she said, her voice breaking into static with each word. "It's feeding." The shadows around the room surged forward, curling and twisting, their edges jagged and sharp. The light from the machine pulsed violently, flickering like a strobe, and I felt the weight of the air shift, pressing down on me so hard I could barely stand. Ellie's body twitched, her limbs moving in unnatural, disjointed motions, and the tape in her hands began to glow, its surface melting into the same dark liquid that pooled around our feet. The machine roared, a deep, guttural sound that shook the walls, and the liquid surged upward, curling around Ellie like smoke. Her eyes locked onto mine, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw her, really saw her. beneath whatever was happening to her. Her lips moved, but I couldn't hear her over the sound of the machine. And then she was gone, swallowed by the darkness. The tape hit the ground with a wet, splattering sound, its surface hissing and bubbling as it dissolved into the liquid. The machine pulsed one last time, the light inside flaring so brightly it burned into my eyes. And then everything went dark. I don't remember how I got out. One moment, I was standing in that room, the weight of the machine pressing down on me, and the next, I was outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. The lodge loomed behind me, dark and silent, its windows empty and hollow, and I could still feel the hum vibrating in my chest. The tapes were gone. Dylan and Ellie were gone. The lodge was quiet now, still, but I knew better. It wasn't over. Whatever had been in those tapes, whatever was in that machine, it wasn't finished. I could feel it, the weight of its presence lingering in the back of my mind, whispering to me, pulling at me, and I knew, deep down, that it wouldn't let me go. The air hung heavy in Black Hollow, a suffocating stillness pressing against our chests like a coiled spring waiting to snap. We should never have come here, but curiosity is a cruel tyrant. The town's forgotten streets sprawled before us, skeletal remains of a place erased from memory, paint peeled from the walls of abandoned houses, windows shattered like jagged teeth, in silent screams, shadows twisted unnaturally, draping the ruins in a cloak of despair. The house stood at the edge of town, a hulking mass of decay and foreboding. Its windows were black, gaping holes. The door hung slightly ajar, as if inviting us to step into the unknown. There was no wind, no sound, only the heavy crunch of our footsteps on brittle leaves as we approached. Every instinct screamed to turn back, to leave this cursed place, but something unspoken pulled us forward. The threshold loomed like the mouth of a predator. Inside, the stench of rot and mildew clawed at our throats. My flashlight flickered, its beam slicing through the oppressive dark, illuminating fragments of a life long abandoned. A broken chair lay toppled in the corner, but deep grooves marred the wooden floor, as though something heavy had been dragged across it. It was Alex who first spotted the mirror. Towering and ornate, it stood against the far wall of the parlor, its frame carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. The glass was dark, not reflective, but absorbing, swallowing the light instead of reflecting it. He reached out, fingers brushing the edge. "Don't touch it," I said sharply, the words escaping before I could stop them. My voice sounded foreign, brittle in the cavernous silence. but it was too late. The moment Alex's hand made contact, a deep, resonant hum reverberated through the house, a vibration that seemed to rise from the very bones of the earth. The air grew cold, biting, and unnatural. My breath clouded before me, each exhalation a fleeting wisp of panic. The sound began low at first, a groan like ancient timbers straining under the weight of time. Then it grew louder, more piercing, until it became an otherworldly scream, raw and unrelenting. It echoed from the walls, reverberated in my chest, drilled into my skull. We froze, paralyzed by the sheer force of it. It came from below. We found the stairs almost by accident, hidden beneath a warped rug in the hallway. Descending into the basement felt like stepping into the maw of some slumbering beast. The air was thicker here, heavier, carrying the weight of things long buried. My flashlight beam quivered, dancing across the rough stone walls as we crept downward. The noise had stopped, replaced by an eerie, unnatural silence. The door stood at the end of the passageway, an ancient slab of wood reinforced with iron bands. Deep claw marks scored its surface, a frantic testament to whatever had once been confined behind it. My hand shook as I reached out, not to open it. God, no, but just to touch it, to confirm it was real. The wood was ice cold, pulsing faintly under my fingertips, as if it had a heartbeat of its own. "Let's go back," Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. "Annie." Her words felt absurdly small in the vast, oppressive dark. But Alex was already moving, his flashlight trained on a strange inscription, etched above the doorframe. The symbols were alien, their shapes writhing in the flickering light, as though they were alive. He read them aloud. The words slithered from his tongue, foreign and jagged, cutting through the stillness like a razor. The temperature plummeted instantly. Frost bloomed across the stone walls, creeping like skeletal fingers. The door groaned, the iron bands buckling as something stirred on the other side. The evil Lorn have served. Then the first knock, a single resonant thud that rattled my teeth and sent my heart into my throat. It came again, louder this time, a hammering insistence that demanded acknowledgement. Each knock reverberated through the room, shaking the foundations, until the final blow splintered the wood. The door burst open. What emerged defied explanation. It was a shadow given form, an absence of light, a presence that twisted reality around it. Tendrils of darkness spilled into the room, writhing and searching, spreading like spilled ink across a blank canvas. It moved without sound, yet its presence screamed in my mind, a cacophony of fear and despair that drowned all coherent thought. We ran, roaring. There was no discussion, no plan, just raw, animal terror propelling us up the stairs and through the house. Behind us, the thing followed, its darkness consuming everything in its path. The walls seemed to shift and twist. The house itself, a living entity bent on trapping us within. Bursting through the front door, we stumbled into the forest. And when, but the forest was no longer the same. The trees, once tall and steadfast, now loomed like skeletal giants, their branches clawing at the sky. The path we had taken into Black Hollow was gone, replaced by a labyrinth of overgrowth and mist. The whispers began, faint and distant at first, like the rustling of leaves, but growing louder, more insistent. They spoke of things no human mind was meant to hear. And I glanced back just once and saw it standing in the doorway, the shadow, featureless and immense, watching us with an intelligence that froze my blood. And it didn't move, but I felt its hunger, a deep and insatiable void that would not stop until it had consumed everything. We plunged into the mist, our breaths sharp and frantic, tearing through the silence. The forest around us was alive with a wrongness I couldn't put into words. The air felt thick, pressing against my skin like damp cotton, and the trees loomed closer with every step, their branches gnarled into grotesque shapes that seemed to reach for us. Behind us, the thing that had escaped the basement never gave chase. Not physically. Its presence lingered, heavy and suffocating, worming its way into my thoughts like an infection. I could still hear the sound of the door breaking, the splintering wood, and the endless, bone-deep hum of its arrival. It felt as though the forest was swallowing us, bending and twisting to keep us within its grasp. Lisa stumbled ahead of me, nearly falling, and I grabbed her arm to steady her. Her eyes were wide, darting in every direction, searching for something, anything that might offer safety. Alex and Emily had veered off somewhere to the right, their voices swallowed by the growing fog. We called for them, our shouts bouncing back at us in muffled echoes that sounded wrong. The mist distorted everything, the ground beneath our feet, the trees around us, even the sound of our own voices. "Do you hear that?" Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible. I strained to listen, and there it was. Faint, almost imperceptible at first, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like the sound of fingers drumming against hollow wood. It seemed to come from all directions, growing louder and more insistent. I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. And it wasn't just sound. It was vibration, a low-frequency thrum that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. The whispers began again, layered beneath the tapping, weaving through it like a sinister melody. They didn't come from outside. They were inside my head, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. A cold realization settled over me. We weren't just lost. We were being hunted. The tapping grew louder, morphing into a series of irregular knocks, and I felt the ground shudder beneath my feet. Lisa froze, clutching my arm so tightly it hurt. "It's here," she said, her voice trembling. I wanted to tell her she was wrong, to assure her that whatever this was couldn't follow us out here, but the words died in my throat. The darkness around us thickened, the fog coalescing into shapes, humanoid but wrong, their limbs stretched and twisted unnaturally, their faces featureless, except for hollow, gaping voids, where eyes should have been. One stepped closer, its body bending in ways that defied logic. I backed away, dragging Lisa with me, but no matter how far we moved, the figures closed in. They didn't rush. They didn't need to. They simply existed, and that was enough to paralyze me with dread. A scream tore through the air, piercing and raw. It wasn't Lisa's, and it wasn't mine. It came from somewhere deep within the mist, where Alex and Emily had disappeared. The sound snapped something inside me, replacing my fear with a desperate need to act. "We have to find them," I said, my voice cracking. Lisa didn't argue. We stumbled forward, blindly navigating the suffocating fog, guided only by the distant echoes of the scream. The whispers grew louder, coalescing into words I couldn't understand, but felt compelled to listen to. They promised safety, escape, an end to the fear, but I knew they were lies. We found Alex first. He was standing in a small clearing, facing away from us. His body was rigid, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. For a moment I thought he was dead, but then I saw the shallow rise and fall of his chest. "Alex," I called out, stepping closer, my voice barely carried in the dense air. He didn't respond, didn't move. As I approached, I realized he was staring at something just out of my line of sight. When I reached him, I saw it. The mirror. It was identical to the one we'd seen in the house, its ornate frame glinting faintly in the dim light. But this one wasn't cracked or weathered. Its surface was pristine, a perfect reflection of the forest around it, except for one thing. In the mirror, Alex wasn't alone. A shadow stood behind him, its form flickering and shifting like smoke caught in a gust of wind. It had no face, no features, but its presence was undeniable. It leaned closer, its formless head hovering just above Alex's shoulder, as though whispering something only he could hear. "Don't look at it," Lisa shouted, but her voice came too late. The shadow in the mirror turned, its void-like face locking onto mine, and for a brief, excruciating moment, I felt it. It wasn't just looking at me. It was inside me, unraveling every thought, every memory, every fear I had ever known. I stumbled back, tearing my gaze away, but the damage was done. The whispers in my head grew louder, more insistent, demanding something I couldn't name. Alex let out a low, guttural sound, a cross between a sob and a laugh, and turned to face us. His eyes were blank, empty, like the mirror had stolen whatever made him Alex. "Run," Lisa whispered, but neither of us moved. We couldn't. Not until Alex took a step toward us, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on tangled strings. The tapping started again, louder this time, and the ground beneath us began to crack. And then the mirror shattered. The explosion of glass sent shards flying in every direction, each fragment catching the faint light and reflecting distorted images of the forest. The shadow spilled out, no longer confined to the mirror, and the darkness surged toward us. This time, we didn't hesitate. We ran, leaving Alex and the broken mirror behind. Our only thought, to escape the encroaching void. But no matter how far we ran, the tapping followed, growing louder, faster, as though the forest itself was closing in. And deep within the mist, the whispers turned to laughter. The forest stretched endlessly before us, the mist growing thicker. With every step, my lungs burned. My legs screamed for rest, but there was no stopping. The tapping had turned into a relentless drum beat in the distance, each hollow thud vibrating through my chest like a warning. Lisa was just ahead of me, her silhouette flickering in and out of the fog, her breathing ragged and panicked. I didn't dare look back. Something brushed against my arm. A fleeting touch, cold and sharp. I whipped around, flashlight swinging wildly, but there was nothing there. Just shadows bleeding into the mist, twisting into shapes that almost looked human. Almost. "Keep moving." Lisa's voice was hoarse, barely more than a rasp. She didn't wait for me to answer. Plunging further into the labyrinth of trees, I stumbled after her, my thoughts spinning out of control. The image of Alex's empty eyes was burned into my mind. The way he had moved, as if his body no longer belonged to him. The way the shadow had consumed the mirror, then spilled into the forest, into us. We reached a clearing, a small pocket of dead grass and broken branches. Lisa stopped abruptly, and I nearly crashed into her. She was staring at something on the ground, her flashlight trembling in her hand. It was Emily's backpack. The sight of it sent a jolt of hope through me, irrational and fleeting. I dropped to my knees, pulling it open, calling her name into the suffocating void. But she didn't answer. The bag was empty, save for her phone, its screen cracked and lifeless. My fingers fumbled with the power button, but it wouldn't turn on. It felt heavier than it should, like it was weighed down with something unseen. "Do you hear that?" Lisa whispered. No. At first I thought it was the tapping again, but no. It was different this time. A low, guttural sound, like something breathing just out of sight. It was wet and labored, each exhale carrying a faint rattle that sent shivers down my spine. My flashlight beam swept across the clearing, illuminating nothing but trees and shadows. Still, the sound persisted. Closer now, almost inside my head. Lisa grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "It's here." Her words were barely audible, but they triggered something primal in me. Fight or flight. I chose flight. We bolted, crashing through the underbrush, not caring about the noise we made. The sound followed us. No, surrounded us, until it felt as though the forest itself was breathing, its labored inhales and exhales filling the air. The ground beneath us grew soft, almost spongy, and with every step I sank deeper into the muck. Lisa tripped, falling hard onto her hands and knees. I skidded to a stop, doubling back to help her, but the sight of what she had fallen on froze me in place. It was a hand, pale and lifeless, jutting out from the earth like a forgotten relic. The skin was stretched taut over bone, the fingers clawed as if in a final desperate plea. But it wasn't the hand that stopped me. Say, it was what it was connected to. The ground split open, revealing a hollow cavity beneath us, a mass of tangled limbs and blank faces writhing in slow, agonized movements. They were fused together, their bodies melting into the earth, their mouths frozen in silent screams. Lisa scrambled back, her breath hitching in sharp, shallow gasps. "What the hell is this?" she whispered, though neither of us expected an answer. The thing beneath us shifted, and I realized the faces weren't looking at me. They were looking through me, their empty eyes locked on something behind me. I didn't want to turn around, but I had no choice. It stood there, a figure carved from darkness, its form shifting and pulsating like a living shadow. It had no features, no discernible shape, yet it exuded an overwhelming presence, a suffocating weight that pressed down on my chest. It raised an arm, if you could call it that, and pointed not at me, but at Lisa. She screamed, a raw, guttural sound that cut through the thick air, and bolted, vanishing into the trees before I could stop her. The figure didn't follow. It simply stood there, its non-existent gaze fixed on me, as if waiting. I don't remember running, only the sensation of my legs moving beneath me, my heart pounding like a war drum. The forest seemed to fold in on itself, the trees bending and twisting, their branches clawing at my clothes and skin. I was blind, lost in a sea of mist and shadows, the whispers in my head growing louder, more insistent. When I finally stopped, gasping for air, I realized I was alone. Lisa was gone. The tapping was gone. The whispers had faded, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed against my ears like cotton. And then I saw it, a clearing different from the one before. Ways, Niubei, Liude, K. At its center stood an altar, if you could call it that, a crude stone slab, weathered and stained, surrounded by flickering torches that burned with an unnatural bluish flame. The air around it shimmered, distorted, like heat waves rising from asphalt. On the altar lay something small and dark, its shape obscured by shadows. But as I stepped closer, I realized it wasn't an object at all. It was a book. Its cover was blackened and cracked, the leather seeming to pulse faintly, as if alive. Symbols were etched into its surface, the same ones we had seen above the door in the basement. They writhed and shifted under the torchlight, refusing to be understood. I didn't want to touch it, didn't want to go near it, but something compelled me forward, an invisible thread pulling me closer, wrapping itself around my thoughts and limbs. My hand moved on its own, trembling as it reached for the book. The moment my fingers brushed the surface, the world shattered, the torches extinguished, plunging the clearing into darkness. The whispers roared back to life, a deafening cacophony that drowned out everything else. The book flew open, its pages flipping violently, though there was no wind. Each page was covered in those writhing symbols, and as I stared, they began to burn, their edges curling and blackening. And then, a voice, not a whisper this time, but a voice, deep and resonant, speaking a language I couldn't understand but somehow felt in my bones. It wasn't speaking to me. It was speaking through me, using my body as a conduit for something ancient and unspeakable. The last thing I remember before the world went black was the sound of the tapping, louder and faster than ever, accompanied by the faintest trace of laughter. When I came to, the air around me felt heavy, saturated with an unnatural stillness that pressed down on my chest. My head throbbed with a deep, rhythmic ache, like the echoes of a drum beat that refused to fade. I blinked against the darkness, the faintest slivers of light filtering through the trees above. My hands were cold and slick, and when I looked down, I saw smears of black streaked across my fingers. It wasn't mud. It didn't feel like mud. The book was still in front of me, its cover now cracked open to the last page. Symbols glowed faintly on the weathered parchment, the light flickering like a dying flame. They weren't just marks. They moved, twisting and pulsing as though alive. My stomach churned as I realized the glow wasn't coming from the book itself, but from the ground beneath it, the faint light spreading outward in jagged veins like cracks in a brittle surface. I wanted to leave it there. Every instinct screamed at me to walk away, to run, and never look back. But something deeper, something darker, wouldn't let me. It was as if my own thoughts weren't mine anymore, as if the whispers had burrowed so deep into my mind that they'd become part of me. My hand reached out, trembling, and closed the book. The light vanished instantly, plunging the clearing into an oppressive blackness. The silence that followed was deafening, thick and suffocating, as though the forest itself had ceased to exist. I stood frozen, every muscle locked, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Then came the sound. It was faint at first, a distant scratching like nails on stone. But it grew louder, sharper, closer. My breath caught in my throat as the trees around the clearing began to shift, their trunks groaning as though bending under an unseen weight. Shadows pooled at their bases, seeping outward like ink spreading across paper, and from those shadows, figures began to rise. They were wrong. That was the only word my mind could form to describe them. Their bodies were warped, stretched into impossible shapes, their limbs too long and thin, their heads tilting at angles that defied anatomy. Their faces, or what should have been faces, were blank voids, empty and featureless. Yet somehow I could feel them looking at me, their gaze cold and unyielding. I stumbled back, clutching the book to my chest as if it could shield me. Envelop. One of the figures stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, its skeletal fingers outstretched. The others followed, a silent, synchronized advance that radiated purpose. They didn't rush. They didn't need to. As they moved closer, I felt something shift in the air. A weight, a pressure, like the forest itself was holding its breath. And then, without warning, the earth beneath my feet split open. I fell, the world around me dissolving into a blur of sound and motion. The descent seemed endless, the darkness swallowing me whole as the cold air whipped past my skin. When I hit the ground, it wasn't hard or solid but soft, yielding, as though I'd landed in a pool of dense, suffocating tar. The ground clung to me, pulling me down as I struggled to move, to breathe. My flashlight was gone, the book ripped from my grasp, and the darkness pressed in from all sides. But even in that suffocating void, I could see them, the figures. Mo, Chiun Li, Ka, Dapol, Hen, the figures. Their shapes flickered and twisted like flames, surrounding me, in a circle that pulsed with an unnatural rhythm. One stepped forward, its body contorting as it reached into the air and pulled. The darkness itself seemed to tear apart at its touch, revealing a doorway, a jagged, pulsating rift that bled faint light into the void. Through it, I could see nothing but shadows, shifting and writhing as if alive. A voice echoed through the space, not a whisper this time, but a deep, guttural resonance that shook the very air around me. It didn't speak words. It spoke something deeper, something that bypassed language and struck at the core of my being. The figures moved closer, their shapes looming over me, blocking out the faint light of the rift. Their hands reached down, skeletal and cold, pulling me from the ground as though I weighed nothing. I struggled, but their grip was unyielding, their strength unnatural. They carried me toward the doorway, their movements deliberate, methodical, and then, just as they reached the threshold, they stopped. The air grew colder, sharper, and the light from the rift flickered violently. The figures turned, their heads tilting in unison toward the darkness beyond. A sound began to rise, a low, guttural growl that rumbled through the void like distant thunder. It wasn't coming from the figures, nor from the rift. It was something else, something deeper, something older. The growl grew louder, sharper, until it became a roar that shook the ground beneath me. The figures released me, their bodies twisting and writhing, as if in pain. They turned back toward the rift, their movements frantic, desperate. One by one, they vanished into the doorway, their shapes dissolving into the shadows beyond. The rift began to close, the jagged edges folding in on themselves. The growl faded, replaced by the faint tapping that had haunted me since the house. It was slow at first, deliberate, but it grew faster, louder, more insistent. And then, just as the rift sealed shut, the tapping stopped. I was alone again, lying on the cold, damp ground. The forest above me, eerily silent. The book lay nearby, its cover closed, the faint symbols on its surface glowing softly in the dark. I didn't want to touch it, didn't want to be near it, but as I stared at it, the whispers returned, faint and distant, calling to me like an old, familiar song. And I knew, without understanding how, that the worst was yet to come. The silence in the forest was suffocating, broken only by the sound of my shallow, uneven breaths. My body ached, my muscles screaming in protest with every movement. As I forced myself upright, the book lay a few feet away, its surface faintly glowing in the dim light. The symbols seemed to pulse, almost breathing, as though it was alive. I didn't want to touch it. Every fiber of my being told me to leave it where it lay, to run as far as I could, but I couldn't. Not because I was too weak, but because I knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever force had tied itself to me, whatever darkness had emerged from that house, wasn't something I could outrun. The book was part of it now. Part of me. The forest around me shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly, as though the trees were leaning closer, their gnarled branches curling inward to what? Shadows flickered at the edges of my vision, moving in ways that defied logic. I swallowed hard, forcing down the rising tide of panic, and picked up the book. Its surface was warm, almost comforting, like it was relieved to be back in my hands. The whispers returned the moment I touched it, soft at first, a gentle murmur that tickled the edges of my consciousness. But they grew louder, more insistent, overlapping in a chaotic chorus that made it impossible to think. I clutched the book tighter, desperate to silence them, but it only made things worse. The symbols on the cover glowed brighter, their shifting forms burning into my vision. A branch snapped behind me. I spun around, the flashlight beam cutting through the mist. For a moment, there was nothing, just the twisted silhouettes of trees and the ever-present fog. But then I saw it, a figure, barely visible through the haze, standing perfectly still. Its outline was familiar, too familiar. Lisa, Misa. My voice cracked as I called out. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, its head tilted slightly, as if studying me. I took a step closer, the flashlight trembling in my hand. Lisa, is that you? She stepped forward, the mist parting around her like a living thing. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unblinking. Something was wrong. Her movements were too smooth, too deliberate, as though she were being guided by invisible strings. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "And don't think to me. Why didn't you save me? And Stella, gave the boy, I do these, save me." The words hit me like a physical blow. My heart clenched, the guilt rising in my chest like bile. I tried, I stammered, the words feeling hollow, even as I said them. I didn't know where you were. I couldn't. Her head tilted further, an unnatural angle that made my stomach churn. You left me. You let them take me. I didn't. The words came out louder, more desperate. Lisa, I swear, She lunged. I barely had time to react, throwing myself backward as her hands clawed at the air where I'd been standing. Her face twisted into something inhuman, her mouth stretching wide in a soundless scream. Her movements were erratic, jerky, like a marionette controlled by an unskilled puppeteer. She came at me again, her fingers curling into claws, and I scrambled to my feet, clutching the book to my chest like a shield. Lisa, stop, I shouted. But it wasn't her anymore. Whatever stood before me, whatever had taken her shape, was no longer human. It was a hollow imitation, a cruel mockery of the friend I'd lost. The shadows around us moved, circling like predators, closing in on their prey. I stumbled backward, the whispers in my head rising to a deafening roar. The symbols on the book's cover flared brightly, casting an eerie light that seemed to push the darkness back. Lisa, or whatever it was, hesitated, its head snapping toward the book with a sharp, unnatural motion. The whispers changed. Eluma. And for the first time, I understood them. Not words exactly, but meaning. A command, clear and undeniable. Open the book. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the worn leather cover. Every instinct screamed at me to stop, to throw the book away and run. But the whispers were relentless, drilling into my mind until I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. With trembling hands, I opened it. The pages were blank. For a moment, I thought I'd made a mistake, that the book was nothing more than an empty shell. But then, the symbols began to appear, one by one, scrawling themselves across the paper in a language I couldn't understand. The light from the book grew brighter, blinding, until I had to shield my eyes. The figure shrieked. It was a sound I'll never forget. Raw, guttural, filled with rage and pain. The ground beneath me shook violently, cracks spidering out from where I stood. The shadows recoiled, writhing as though in agony, and the mist seemed to evaporate, revealing the forest for the first time. The figure fell to its knees, its form dissolving into ash and smoke. For a moment, everything was still. Still. The whispers faded. The air grew calm, and I allowed myself to believe it was over. But then the laughter started. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder with each passing second. Not one voice, but many, a cacophony of mocking, guttural chuckles that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The light from the book dimmed, the symbols on its pages shifting once more. Vi want du vel, nu. And then I saw them, figures emerging from the trees, dozens of them, their shapes flickering and distorted. They moved as one, their hollow eyes fixed on me. The whispers returned, louder than ever, filling my head with words I couldn't understand, but felt deep in my bones. The book grew heavier in my hands, its surface burning hot. Unwind. I ran. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees twisting and bending to block my path. The laughter followed, echoing through the darkness, and the whispers grew more frenzied, more demanding. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care. Ugh. All I knew was that I had to keep moving. The ground beneath me shifted, the earth cracking and splintering as though something massive was stirring beneath it. I stumbled, nearly falling, but forced myself forward, clutching the book like it was the only thing keeping me alive. And as I ran, one thought echoed through my mind, clearer than the whispers, louder than the laughter. There was no escape. I didn't know how long I had been running. Time had lost all meaning in the endless maze of trees and fog. My legs were weak, trembling under me, but I couldn't stop. I didn't dare. The whispers had dulled to a low hum, a constant pressure in the back of my mind. But the laughter hadn't stopped. It came in bursts, distant and mocking, chasing me through the darkness like a cruel predator. The book burned in my hands, its surface growing hotter with each passing moment. I wanted to drop it, to let it sink into the damp earth and disappear forever, but my fingers wouldn't obey. What? It was as if the book had fused to me. Its weight, a permanent reminder of everything I'd lost. Every step forward felt like dragging my own shadow behind me. I stumbled into a clearing, the sudden openness jarring after the suffocating press of the forest. The ground here was different, hard, cracked, as if scorched by something that had leached the life from it. At the center stood a tree, its bark blackened and twisted, its branches reaching upward like skeletal hands. Hanging from one of those branches was a figure. My breath caught in my throat as I took a step closer. It was Lisa. She hung limply, her head tilted downward, her hair falling across her face like a curtain. Her arms dangled at her sides, her feet barely brushing the ground. The rope around her neck wasn't made of fibers but something organic, veins or roots, pulsing faintly with an unnatural rhythm. "Lisa," I whispered, the word trembling from my lips. She didn't move. No. My heart pounded as I edged closer, each step filling me with equal parts dread and hope. When I was only a few feet away, her head snapped up. Her eyes were gone. In their place were hollow voids, black and endless, consuming the faint light around them. Her mouth opened, but no words came out, only a low, guttural sound that vibrated through the air like a warning. The rope around her neck tightened, pulling her higher into the tree, her body jerking unnaturally as she rose. "Why didn't you save her?" The voice didn't come from Lisa. It bell glass came from everywhere. It was deep, resonant, like the forest itself was speaking to me. My head whipped around, searching for the source, but there was no one. Nothing, only shadows, shifting and writhing at the edges of the clearing. You left her, the voice continued, each word laced with accusation. You let her die. No, I shouted, the sound raw in my throat. I didn't. The book in my hands flared with light, the symbols on its cover burning brighter than ever. The ground beneath me began to crack, jagged lines snaking outward from where I stood. The shadows surged forward, twisting into shapes that towered over me, their forms flickering like flames in the wind. Look, the voice commanded. The book flew open on its own, its pages flipping violently until they stopped on one filled with glowing symbols. Images began to appear, carved into the parchment like a grotesque tapestry. I saw myself running through the forest, the book clutched tightly in my hand. I saw Alex standing in the mist, his eyes blank and lifeless. I saw Lisa hanging from the tree, her body contorted into something inhuman. And then I saw Emily. She was alive. The image shifted, revealing her somewhere deep within the forest. She was kneeling on the ground, her hands clutching something. A knife, its blade stained dark. Her face was pale, her expression a mixture of terror and resolve. Around her, the shadows circled, their forms pressing closer as if drawn to her. She is the key, the voice said. Only one may leave. What does that mean? I demanded, my voice cracking with desperation. What do you want from me? The laughter returned, louder this time, a cacophony of voices that drowned out my thoughts. The book slammed shut, the force of it sending me stumbling backward. The shadows surged forward, enveloping the clearing in darkness, and I felt the ground give way beneath me. I fell, the world spinning around me, until I hit solid ground with a jarring thud. The air was colder here, sharper, and the whispers had returned, louder and more insistent. I pushed myself up, my flashlight somehow still in my hand, its beam cutting through the darkness. I was in a cavern, the walls slick and glistening with something I didn't want to name. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the sound of dripping water echoed faintly in the distance. The book lay open on the ground in front of me, its pages glowing faintly in the dim light. And then I saw her. Emily was here, just as the book had shown. She was standing at the far end of the cavern, her back to me, the knife still clutched in her hands. Her shoulders were shaking, and I realized she was crying. "Emily," I called out, my voice echoing through the space. She stiffened, but didn't turn around. "Stay back," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I know what it wants." "What are you talking about?" I asked, taking a cautious step forward. "We can get out of here. We just have to—" "No," she interrupted, her voice sharper now. She turned to face me, her eyes wild with fear, and something else I couldn't place. It won't let us both leave. It's been playing with us this whole time, and now it's forcing us to choose." I froze, her words sinking in. The whispers in my head grew louder, more frenzied, and the symbols on the book began to glow brighter once more. The cavern shook, the walls groaning under an unseen force, and I realized she was right. It wanted a sacrifice. The knife in her hand gleamed faintly in the dim light, and for a moment I thought she was going to use it on herself. But then she looked at me, and I saw the determination in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said, and then she lunged. Emily's scream echoed through the cavern, a raw, guttural sound that shattered the air. She lunged, the knife glinting faintly in her hand, her face contorted with equal parts terror and resolve. My instincts screamed at me to run, to defend myself, but I couldn't move. My legs felt rooted to the ground, my hands frozen at my sides, the weight of the book pressing against my chest like a curse. Time seemed to stretch as she closed the distance, her steps unsteady but deliberate, the knife raised high. The whispers in my head surged to a deafening roar, their chaotic voices colliding, drowning out any coherent thought. They weren't just speaking, they were commanding, urging me to act, to fight, to survive. I raised my hands, instinct taking over, and caught her wrist just as the knife came down. The force of her attack drove me backward, my heels skidding on the slick stone floor. Her strength surprised me, wild, frantic, as though it wasn't entirely her own. Her eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment I saw the Emily I knew, but it was fleeting, a flicker of recognition drowned in a sea of fear and desperation. "You don't understand," she screamed, her voice breaking. "It has to be one of us. If we don't..." Her words were cut off by a low, rumbling growl that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The cavern trembled, loose stones clattering to the ground, and the shadows around us began to move. They weren't just shapes anymore. They were alive, twisting and writhing, coiling around us like serpents. Emily's grip faltered, her gaze darting to the encroaching darkness. I took the chance and wrenched the knife from her hand, the blade clattering to the ground. She stumbled back, her chest heaving, her eyes wide with panic. "It's not us," I shouted, the words tumbling out. Before I could think, "It's the book. It's been controlling everything, pushing us, forcing us to..." Another growl interrupted me, louder this time, and the shadows surged forward. They didn't attack. They surrounded us, creating a perfect circle of darkness that cut us off from the rest of the cavern. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the book in my hands began to glow. Emily dropped to her knees, her hands clutching her head as though trying to block out the sound. "It's too late," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "It's already decided." The symbols on the book flared, brighter than they had ever been, and the pages began to turn on their own. The air grew colder, sharper, and a feeling of immense pressure filled the space, as though the cavern itself was collapsing inward. The shadows writhed, their movements becoming frantic, almost desperate. A voice rose above the chaos. Not Emily's, not mine. It was deep, resonant, a guttural sound that vibrated through my bones. It spoke in a language I couldn't understand. Yet its meaning was clear. The choice had to be made. I turned to Emily, my heart pounding. Who would you fool? She was staring at me now, her face pale, her eyes hollow. It's not just about us, she said, her voice trembling. It's about everything. If we don't finish this, it won't stop. It'll spread. I didn't respond. I couldn't. The weight of her words pressed down on me, suffocating. The whispers twisted in my mind, urging me to act, to choose. But my body refused to move. The book in my hands grew hotter, its glow almost blinding, and I felt something shift deep within me. Emily stood, her movements slow and deliberate, and picked up the knife. She didn't lunge this time. She held it out, the blade trembling in her hand. You know what it wants, she said softly. It's not going to let us both leave. Hungrigo paver dan force like smoke. The truth of her words hung heavy in the air. Haitun. The shadows around us grew still, their movements halting, as though waiting, watching. The book's glow dimmed slightly, its pages settling, and the whispers faded to a low murmur. Time seemed to pause, the cavern holding its breath. My hands tightened around the book, the leather warm and alive under my fingers. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to accept that this was the only way. But the voice, the shadows, the book, they all screamed the same thing. Sacrifice. I can't, I whispered, my voice cracking. Emily, I can't. Her hand shot out, grabbing mine, forcing the knife into my grip. Her touch was cold, her fingers trembling. Then I will, she said, her voice firm, despite the tears streaming down her face. But you have to promise me. You'll end it. You'll stop it. Before I could respond, she stepped back, the blade still in my hand, her expression a mixture of sorrow and resolve. The shadows surged forward, encircling her, their forms pulsing with anticipation. The whispers grew louder, chanting, demanding, urging me to act. I'm sorry, she whispered. The blade felt impossibly heavy as I raised it, my hands shaking, my vision blurred by tears. Time slowed, each second stretching into an eternity as I stepped toward her. Her eyes never left mine, even as the shadows closed in, even as the whispers reached a deafening crescendo. Ah, the blade fell. Here we were. The blade fell. The cavern exploded with light, a blinding, searing brightness that consumed everything. The shadows screamed, their forms dissolving into nothingness, their presence wiped away in an instant. The whispers stopped. The air grew still, and for a moment There was nothing. No sound, no movement, no pain. When the light faded, I was alone. The cavern was silent, the shadows gone, the air warm and still. The book lay on the ground, its cover closed, the symbols dim and lifeless. My hands were empty, the knife nowhere to be seen. I sank to my knees, the weight of what I'd done crashing over me like a tidal wave. I don't know how long I stayed there, staring at the book, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. The forest above was silent, the whispers gone, the laughter a distant memory. And yet, as I picked up the book and stepped out into the fading light of dawn, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that it was only waiting for the next choice. Karin. The forest was still, unnaturally so, as if it held its breath, waiting for something to break the silence. The air was thick, suffused with the damp, earthy smell of rotting leaves and moss-covered stones. I adjusted my flashlight, the beam slicing through the darkness, but it barely seemed to touch the shadows. The trees loomed over us like silent sentinels, their branches twisted and gnarled, clawing at the night sky. We had been hiking for hours, scouting locations for the documentary. Tasha said this area was rich with stories of ghost towns and lost legends, and we wanted something raw, something that would crawl under the skin of our audience. But the deeper we ventured, the more I felt we were crossing an invisible boundary, stepping into a place we weren't meant to be. The others were just ahead, Eric with his confident stride, Ben cracking jokes to ease the tension, and Tasha always a few steps ahead, her camera in hand, capturing everything. The light from their flashlights flickered like will-o'-the-wisps, bobbing in and out of view as they weaved through the trees. I tried to focus on the rhythm of my footsteps, the crunch of leaves beneath my boots, anything to distract from the growing weight in my chest. Then we saw it. The entrance to the cave yawned open before us, a jagged scar in the hillside. Its edges were uneven, like the mouth of some ancient beast frozen mid-roar. My stomach tightened. There was something wrong about it. Something primal, almost magnetic. It pulled at me, at all of us, in a way that defied explanation. The air around it was colder, sharper, as if it carried the memory of countless winters. Tasha was the first to approach. Her flashlight swept over the entrance, revealing faint carvings etched into the stone. Symbols, weathered with time, their shapes alien and chaotic. They seemed to writhe under the light, shifting ever so slightly. When I looked away, I tried to tell myself it was a trick of the shadows. But deep down, I knew better. Ben muttered something about how creepy it looked, but his voice was distant, muffled, as if the cave itself absorbed sound. Eric stepped forward, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust, and the four of us followed him inside. The temperature dropped instantly. The air was damp, clinging to my skin like a second layer, and the light from our flashlights barely penetrated the darkness. The walls of the cave were slick with moisture, and the floor uneven, forcing us to move slowly. Tasha was filming everything, her camera's red light blinking rhythmically in the gloom. As we ventured deeper, the carvings grew more intricate, more deliberate. They covered every surface, spiraling and intersecting in a way that made my eyes ache. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching us, recording our every move. Then, in the center of the chamber, we saw the altar. It was crude, hewn from stone and slick with moss, yet it commanded the space as if it had always been there. Resting on its surface was a flat slab of black stone, its surface polished to a mirror-like sheen. The carvings here were sharper, their edges unyielding, and they radiated a faint, almost imperceptible hum. I don't know why I reached out to touch it. Maybe it was the silence, the way the others seemed frozen in place, their faces pale and their eyes wide. Or maybe it was something deeper, something the stone itself whispered to me. My fingers brushed its surface, and the hum became a roar. The ground trembled, a deep vibration that rose from the earth's core and shook the walls around us. Dust and small rocks rained down, and the air was filled with the sound of something breaking, something ancient and vast. The carvings on the altar flared to life, glowing faintly, their light pulsing in time with the vibrations. Then the voices started. They weren't loud, not at first, just whispers, faint and indistinct, threading through the air like smoke. But they grew, overlapping and colliding until they filled the space. A cacophony of sounds that didn't belong to any language I knew. They spoke to me, to all of us, in a way that wasn't heard, but felt. They pulled at the edges of my mind, unraveling my thoughts, exposing every fear, every doubt. Eric shouted something, but I couldn't hear him over the voices. Tasha dropped her camera, the device hitting the ground with a hollow thud. The red light blinked once, then went out. Ben stumbled backward, his flashlight clattering to the floor and spinning wildly, its beam casting erratic shadows on the walls. The shadows moved. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, the way the beam twisted and flickered, but the shadows weren't just moving, they were reaching. Long, spindly tendrils stretched out from the edges of the chamber, curling and twisting like living things. They wrapped around the carvings, caressing them, feeding on their glow. One of them touched Ben. He screamed, a sound that tore through the air and froze the blood in my veins. His body jerked violently, his back arching as if something had taken hold of him. The shadows enveloped him, their forms flickering and shifting, and I saw his face for only a moment. His eyes were wide, his mouth open in a silent plea. and then he was gone. The whispers stopped. Kyle, Hiuwaini, Hendalay, Shelf. The silence that followed was worse. It pressed against me, heavy and oppressive. The weight of 1,000 unspoken things. The altar was dark now, its glow extinguished, and the air was still, as if the cave itself was holding its breath. We stood there, motionless, staring at the spot where Ben had been. My hands were shaking, my heart beat thunderous in my ears. Eric turned to me, his face pale, his eyes hollow, and for the first time I saw fear in him. We have to leave, he said, his voice trembling. But as I turned toward the entrance, the cave seemed to shift. The path we had taken was gone, replaced by an endless tunnel of darkness. And deep within that darkness, something moved. The air felt wrong. Heavy, thick, as if the cave had swallowed all the oxygen and left us gasping for something that wasn't there. My flashlight's beam seemed weaker now, barely penetrating the suffocating darkness. The walls felt closer than before, the carvings on their surface pulsing faintly like veins under skin. The faint hum of the altar had gone silent, but the absence of sound was worse. Eric grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my skin. His face was pale, sweat dripping from his forehead, his eyes darting to every shadow. "We need to go," he hissed, his voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't panic. It was something deeper, more primal. But the words felt hollow. There was no way out. The entrance we had come through was gone, swallowed by the shifting walls of the cave. Tasha stood frozen, staring at the place where Ben had vanished. Her camera lay forgotten on the ground, its lens cracked, the blinking red light extinguished. She didn't move, didn't speak, as if her mind couldn't process what had happened. I reached for her, my hand shaking, but stopped when I saw her eyes. They were wide, unfocused, reflecting the faint glow of the carvings. "Come on," I said, my voice trembling. "Iuda, ne devil, keu. We can't stay here." She didn't respond. Her lips moved silently, forming words I couldn't hear, couldn't understand. I shook her hard, and she blinked, her gaze snapping to mine. "We're not alone," she whispered, her voice so soft it was almost lost in the oppressive silence. My stomach twisted. She was right. I could feel it, the presence, the weight of something watching us from the shadows. It was the same feeling I'd had since we entered the cave, but now it was stronger, closer, suffocating. I turned slowly, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, and for a moment I thought I saw movement, a flicker of something just at the edge of the beam. Wala, Teru, Telube, Day. Oh, too fast to make out, too slow to ignore. But Eric started forward, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "We have to keep moving," he said, his voice tight. "Staying here isn't an option." I didn't argue. We needed to do something, anything, to break the suffocating grip of fear that had paralyzed us. I pulled Tasha along, her steps hesitant, her breathing shallow. The tunnel stretched endlessly before us, its walls closing in, the carvings growing more erratic, more chaotic. The symbols seemed alive now, writhing and shifting under the flickering light. Then we heard it. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible. A low, rhythmic tapping that echoed through the tunnel. It wasn't natural, not the sound of water dripping or rocks settling. It was deliberate, calculated, like fingers drumming on stone. The sound sent a chill down my spine, my breath catching in my throat. Eric froze, his flashlight beam darting wildly. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, unable to speak. The tapping grew louder, closer, each sound reverberating through the air, vibrating in my chest. It wasn't coming from one direction. It was everywhere, surrounding us, filling the space with its unnerving rhythm. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out every other sound, every other thought. Tasha stopped walking, her eyes fixed on something ahead. "There," she said, her voice barely audible. I followed her gaze, my flashlight trembling as I lifted it. The beam illuminated the tunnel ahead, and for a moment I thought it was empty. Then I saw them. Figures. Figures. They were barely more than shadows, shapes that seemed to blend into the darkness, their edges flickering and shifting like smoke. They had no faces, no features, just smooth, featureless forms that radiated a suffocating wrongness. They stood motionless, their heads tilted slightly, as if listening, watching. The tapping stopped. Eric took a step back, his breathing ragged. "We need to run," he said, his voice shaking, but my legs wouldn't move. The figures didn't move either, but their presence was overwhelming, crushing. The darkness around them seemed to pulse, growing thicker, heavier, until it felt like it would swallow us whole. Then one of them stepped forward. The movement was slow, deliberate, the sound of its footfall impossibly loud in the suffocating silence. It didn't walk. It glided, its body flickering like a dying flame. My flashlight flickered, the beam dimming as if drained by its presence. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. The figure stopped, a few feet away, its head tilting slightly, and I felt its gaze on me, even though it had no eyes. And then it whispered. The sound wasn't loud. It was barely a sound at all, but it was inside my head, threading through my thoughts like smoke, coiling around my memories, my fears. The words weren't in any language I understood, but their meaning was clear. They weren't asking for something. They were demanding it. Eric broke first. He turned and ran, his flashlight bouncing wildly, his footsteps echoing through the tunnel. The figures didn't follow. They didn't need to. The darkness itself seemed to ripple, closing around him, swallowing him whole. His scream was brief. Tasha and I were alone now. The silence heavier than ever. The figure in front of us hadn't moved, but the others were closer, their forms flickering at the edges of my vision. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. My mind was unraveling, the whispers pulling at the edges of my sanity. Tasha grabbed my arm, her grip so tight it hurt. "We have to go," she said, her voice shaking. "No." "Do you?" I nodded, forcing my legs to move, forcing my body to obey. We ran, the light from our flashlights barely illuminating the twisting tunnel ahead. The whispers followed, growing louder, more insistent, their words clawing at my mind. And deep in the shadows behind us, the tapping began again. We ran without direction, the tunnel stretching endlessly ahead of us. My flashlight bobbed wildly, casting erratic shadows that twisted into impossible shapes. The tapping grew louder, faster, like a heartbeat racing toward an inevitable end. My lungs burned, my legs screamed for rest, but I couldn't stop, not when the shadows behind us seemed to pulse with life, inching closer with every breath. Tasha was ahead of me, her movements frantic, almost mechanical. Her camera swung uselessly around her neck, the cracked lens glinting faintly in the dim light. Her breaths were short, shallow, punctuated by the occasional gasp. I wanted to call out to her, to tell her to slow down, but my voice wouldn't come. Fear had stolen it, wrapped its icy fingers around my throat and squeezed. The tunnel began to change. The carvings on the walls grew denser, more intricate, spiral and intersecting in ways that defied logic. They seemed to shimmer as I passed, their edges glowing faintly like embers on the verge of ignition. The air grew colder, sharper, carrying with it the faint metallic tang of something ancient. Something wrong. I stumbled, my foot catching on a jagged rock, and fell hard onto the uneven ground. Pain shot through my hands and knees, sharp and electric, but I barely felt it. My flashlight skittered away, its beam spinning wildly. And for a moment, the world was a chaos of light and shadow. "Tasha!" I called out, my voice cracking. She stopped, turning toward me, her face pale and streaked with sweat. Her flashlight cast long, jagged shadows across the walls, and for a moment, I thought I saw something move behind her. A flicker of darkness, there and gone, too quick to be real. "Get up!" she shouted, her voice trembling. "It's coming!" I scrambled to my feet, grabbing my flashlight and swinging it toward the darkness behind us. The beam caught only empty space, the tunnel stretching endlessly into the void. But I knew better. I could feel it, an unseen weight pressing against my back, a presence that watched and waited, feeding on the fear it had cultivated. We kept moving, the tunnel narrowing around us, its walls slick with moisture. The carvings began to change. They weren't just symbols anymore. They were faces, twisted, anguished faces, their mouths frozen in silent screams, their eyes wide with terror. They stared at me as I passed, their expressions etched into the stone, as though they had been trapped mid-suffering. "Tasha," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Do you see them?" She didn't answer, didn't even look back. Her steps quickened, her flashlight jerking with every movement. The tapping was louder now, almost deafening, and it wasn't coming from behind us anymore. It was ahead, waiting. The tunnel opened suddenly into a vast chamber, the space so large that my flashlight barely illuminated the far walls. The air here was different, heavier, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. The floor was uneven, a jagged patchwork of stone and dirt, and at its center was another altar. This one was larger, more intricate, its surface covered in carvings that glowed faintly in the dim light. The symbols here were different from the ones we had seen before. Etest. They pulsed in time with the tapping, their rhythm slow and deliberate, like the beating of a massive, unseen heart. Tasha stopped at the edge of the chamber, her flashlight fixed on the altar. She didn't move, didn't speak, her entire body frozen, as though rooted to the spot. I stepped closer, my breath shallow, my heart pounding in my chest. The air grew colder with every step, the whispers returning, louder now, clearer. They were calling to us. The altar radiated a strange warmth, a stark contrast to the icy air around it. The carvings seemed to writhe under my gaze, their shapes shifting and flowing like liquid, forming patterns I couldn't comprehend. The whispers grew louder, their words threading through my thoughts, weaving a tapestry of dread and despair. I reached out, my hand trembling, but Tasha grabbed my arm, her grip like iron. "Don't," she said, her voice low and urgent. "It's what it wants." I pulled away, taking a step back. The whispers faltered for a moment, their rhythm breaking, but they didn't stop. They never stopped. Gul, Edes, Doilen. I turned to Tasha, her face pale and drawn, her eyes locked on the altar. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice shaking. "It's not safe." Before I could respond, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, crushing, like the world itself had ceased to exist. The carvings on the altar dimmed, their light flickering before vanishing entirely. The air grew heavier, pressing down on my chest, and I struggled to breathe. Then the shadows moved. They surged forward from the edges of the chamber, flowing like water, their forms twisting and writhing as they closed in. They weren't just shadows, they were figures, tall and featureless, their edges flickering like the flame of a dying candle. They didn't walk, they glided, their movements smooth and unnatural, their presence suffocating. Tasha grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the far end of the chamber. "Run!" she shouted, her voice breaking. We stumbled across the uneven ground, the shadows closing in around us, their movements quickening. The whispers rose to a crescendo, their voices overlapping, colliding, filling my head with a chaos of sound and sensation. My flashlight flickered, its beam faltering, and I felt the cold touch of something brush against my shoulder. We reached another tunnel, its entrance barely visible in the dim light. Tasha dove in first, her flashlight cutting through the darkness, and I followed, the shadows clawing at my heels. The walls here were closer, the space tighter, and the air carried the faint metallic tang of blood. The whispers faded as we ran, their voices replaced by the sound of our ragged breathing, the pounding of our footsteps. But the shadows didn't stop. They followed, silent and relentless, their presence a constant weight pressing against my back. And deep in the distance, the tapping began again. The tunnel seemed to stretch forever, the air growing colder with every step. My legs burned, my chest heaved, and every breath felt like dragging shards of ice into my lungs. Behind us, the tapping echoed faintly, a rhythmic reminder that whatever was following hadn't given up. My flashlight flickered again, its beam weak and inconsistent, casting more shadows than it dispelled. Tasha was ahead of me, her movements jerky, frantic. She didn't look back, didn't say a word. Her silence was louder than anything else, an oppressive weight that pressed down on us as heavily as the darkness. I wanted to call out to her, to ask if she was okay, but I couldn't force the words past the lump in my throat. Talking felt dangerous, like it would draw attention to us, in ways the shadows hadn't already. The tunnel began to shift. The walls narrowed, pressing closer, their jagged surfaces glinting faintly in the dim light. The carvings returned, different now, more erratic, more violent. They slashed across the stone in wild, chaotic patterns, their shapes sharp and jagged, like wounds carved into the earth itself. The whispers returned too, faint at first, threading through the air like a gentle breeze. But they grew louder with every step, overlapping and colliding in a chaotic symphony of sound. My head pounded. The whispers weren't just noise. They were inside me, burrowing into my thoughts, clawing at the edges of my mind. They didn't speak words, but they didn't have to. Their meaning was clear. Yeah, everything was clear. They were hungry, and we were prey. Tasha stopped suddenly, her flashlight beam cutting across the narrow tunnel. I nearly ran into her, my heart pounding as I followed her gaze. The tunnel opened into another chamber, smaller this time, the walls slick with moisture. The air here was heavier, colder, and the whispers seemed to vibrate through the space, bouncing off the walls in an endless echo. At the center of the chamber was a figure. It was hunched over, its back to us, its shape barely discernible in the weak light. Its limbs were long and thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and its skin, or what passed for it, was dark and glistening, as though it had been pulled from the depths of some black, oily sea. It didn't move, didn't acknowledge us, but its presence filled the space, oppressive and suffocating. Tasha took a step back, her breath hitching. Her flashlight beam wavered, and for a moment it landed on the figure's face, or where its face should have been. It had no eyes, no mouth, no features at all, just a smooth, featureless surface that reflected the faint glow of the carvings. And yet I felt its gaze, heavy and unyielding, boring into me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I reached out, grabbing Tasha's arm, and she flinched, her gaze snapping to mine. Her eyes were wide, filled with a mix of terror and something else, something darker. "We need to go," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure moved. It didn't turn, didn't stand. It simply shifted, its head tilting further, its body twisting unnaturally, as though the very act of moving was foreign to it. The shadows around it seemed to pulse, writhing and twisting like living things. And the whispers grew louder, their chaotic voices rising to a crescendo. I pulled Tasha back, my grip tightening on her arm. "Emulos, Omi. Go, go," I shouted, my voice breaking, and we turned, running back into the tunnel. The tapping returned, faster now, more erratic, like the panicked heartbeat of some unseen beast. The shadows surged around us, closing in, their forms flickering and shifting at the edges of my vision. The whispers were deafening, drowning out everything else, filling my head with noise, with fear, with despair. We ran until the tunnel opened into another chamber, and I stopped, doubling over, my breaths ragged and shallow. Tasha collapsed against the wall, her flashlight clattering to the ground. The beam flickered once, then went out, leaving us in near total darkness. I fumbled with my own flashlight, slapping it against my palm, until the beam steadied, weak but functional. The chamber was small, the walls smooth and unmarked, devoid of the carvings that had plagued the rest of the tunnels. At its center was a shallow pool of water, its surface perfectly still, reflecting the faint light like a mirror. The air here was colder, sharper, and the whispers were quieter, more distant, as though we had crossed some invisible threshold. Tasha stared at the pool, her expression unreadable. "Ellie, this isn't right," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "None of this is right." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My gaze was fixed on the water, on the faint shapes that moved beneath its surface. They were indistinct, shifting and flickering like shadows caught in a restless current. But they were there, watching. The tapping stopped. The silence was sudden, absolute, and it pressed against me with a weight that stole my breath. The shapes in the water grew clearer, their movements more deliberate, and I realized with a sinking dread that they were rent reflections. What? They were faces, hundreds of them. They stared up at me, their expressions twisted in anguish, their mouths open in silent screams. Their eyes, if you could call them that, were hollow voids, empty and consuming, and yet I felt their gaze as surely as I felt the cold air around me. One by one, they turned toward Tasha, their movements slow and synchronized, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. Tasha took a step back, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "What do they want?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The water rippled. I grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the pool. But it was too late. The faces shifted, their mouths opening wider, and a sound rose from the water. a low, guttural growl that shook the ground beneath us. The shadows surged forward, their forms coalescing into figures, tall and featureless, their presence suffocating. The pool erupted. Water sprayed across the chamber, icy and stinging, and the figures moved, faster than before, their shapes flickering and shifting as they closed in. I pulled Tasha toward the tunnel, the whispers screaming in my head, the shadows clawing at my heels. And deep in the distance, the tapping began again. The cold clung to my skin like a second layer, sharp and biting as we tore through the tunnel. The walls felt closer now, the air thinner, suffocating. The shadows didn't move the way they should. They twisted unnaturally, pressing against the edges of my vision, flickering like distorted memories I couldn't shake. The whispers were louder again, not a hum, but a crescendo, their chaotic voices grinding against my thoughts. I couldn't tell if they were speaking to me, through me, or simply invading. Tasha was ahead, her flashlight cutting weakly through the dark, her movements erratic, panic. I hear her breaths, shallow and ragged, the rhythm broken and uneven. My own pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else except the whispers and the tapping. It had followed us again, closer this time. Its pace quickened, frantic, each sound sharp and deliberate, like it was spelling out some dreadful warning I couldn't understand. My legs burned, but there was no room for exhaustion. Stopping wasn't an option. Not here. The tunnel opened abruptly, spilling us into another chamber. This one was smaller, claustrophobic, its walls slick and glistening, as if the stone itself were sweating. The carvings were back, spiraling and jagged, cutting deep into the rock like wounds that refused to heal. They glowed faintly, their light pulsating in time with the tapping, casting twisted shadows that danced across the uneven floor. Tasha stumbled to a stop, her flashlight shaking in her hand. Her eyes darted around the room, wild and unfocused, her face pale and streaked with sweat. I grabbed her arm, trying to steady her, but she jerked away, her movements sharp and frantic. "They're everywhere," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They're watching us." I didn't need to ask who. I could feel them too, the weight of unseen eyes, pressing against my back, my chest, my mind. The shadows in the corners of the chamber seemed thicker here, heavier, almost tangible. They moved when I wasn't looking, creeping closer, their edges flickering and dissolving like smoke caught in a restless wind. At the center of the room stood another altar. This one was smaller than the others we'd seen, its surface rough and uneven, as if it had been carved in haste. Resting atop it was a single object, a shard of stone, jagged and black, its edges glinting faintly in the dim light. It looked like a piece of the altar from the first chamber, but smaller, darker, and somehow more alive. The carvings around it spiraled inward, their patterns chaotic, yet deliberate, as though drawn to it. Tasha took a step forward, her gaze fixed on the shard. "This is it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. This is what it's been leading us to. Dal. Her words didn't make sense, but they didn't have to. The shard pulsed faintly, a rhythmic glow that seemed to match the tapping, the whispers, the frantic pounding of my own heart. It was as if the stone was alive, breathing, waiting. The air around it was colder, sharper, filled with an unspoken tension that pressed against my chest. "We can't stay here," I said, my voice hoarse. "Tasha, we need to leave." She didn't respond. Her hand hovered over the shard, her fingers trembling, her breaths shallow and uneven. I reached out to pull her back, but the moment my hand touched her shoulder, the chamber erupted. The carvings flared to life, their glow blinding, their shapes writhing and shifting as though they were tearing themselves free from the stone. The shadows surged forward, no longer content to linger at the edges. They poured into the room like a flood, their forms flickering and amorphous, their movements erratic and chaotic. The whispers became a scream, loud and all-encompassing, a sound that vibrated through my bones and filled my head with static. Tasha grabbed the shard. The room went still. The shadows froze, their forms flickering like dying flames, their presence still suffocating, but no longer advancing. The whispers faltered, their voices breaking, fading into a low hum that vibrated in the back of my skull. The shard in Tasha's hand glowed brighter, its surface pulsing with an intensity that made my vision blur. And then she screamed. It wasn't a scream of fear or pain. It was something deeper, more primal, a sound that clawed at the edges of my sanity. Her body convulsed, her fingers tightening around the shard as if it were trying to escape. The glow from the shard spread, crawling up her arm, sinking into her skin, her veins lighting up like molten lava. I tried to grab her, to pull her away, but the moment my fingers touched her, a shockwave tore through the room. It knocked me back, slamming me into the wall, the impact driving the air from my lungs. The shard fell from her hand, clattering to the ground, its glow fading to a faint ember. Tasha collapsed, her body limp, her breaths shallow and ragged. The shadows moved again. They didn't rush us, didn't surge forward like before. Instead, they circled, their movements slow and deliberate, their forms coalescing into shapes that were almost human. Almost. Their heads tilted, their hollow gazes fixed on Tasha, their presence radiating hunger. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the shard without thinking. The moment my fingers closed around it, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent, their chaotic voices drilling into my thoughts. The shadows recoiled slightly, their forms flickering, their movements hesitant. Tasha stirred, her eyes fluttering open, her face pale and drenched in sweat. "We have to go," she whispered, her voice weak. "It's not done with us." I didn't need to be told twice. I pulled her to her feet, her weight heavy against me, and together we stumbled toward the tunnel. The shadows didn't follow, but their presence lingered, pressing against my back, filling the air with a suffocating dread. The tapping began again, slower this time, more deliberate, as if it were counting down to something. The shard pulsed faintly in my hand, its glow a weak, steady rhythm that matched the pounding of my heart. The tunnel stretched endlessly ahead, the air growing colder, the darkness thicker, and somewhere in the distance, something waited. The tunnel stretched on, endless and oppressive, the air growing colder with each step. The shard in my hand pulsed faintly, a weak and rhythmic glow that seemed synchronized with my pounding heart. Tasha leaned heavily against me, her breath shallow, her body trembling. The weight of her was more than physical. It was the dread clinging to both of us, dragging us down, whispering that there was no way out. The tapping was still there, slower now, more deliberate. Each strike echoed faintly through the tunnel, a haunting rhythm that filled the spaces between the whispers in my head. Those voices had changed too, no longer chaotic and overlapping, but unified, a single low murmur that spoke directly to me. It didn't use words, but the meaning was clear. Keep going. The carvings on the walls became more jagged, more erratic, their glow dim but insistent, like embers waiting for a spark. They weren't just decorations anymore. They were alive, shifting and twisting as I passed, their shapes forming fleeting images that dissolved before I could fully comprehend them. Faces, unfamiliar, bay. Faces, hands picked, something clawing at the edges of the stone, desperate to break free. Tasha, I whispered, my voice cracking. We can't stop. She didn't answer, but her hand tightened weakly on my arm. I kept moving, dragging her along, my flashlight casting a shaky, narrow beam of light ahead. The air felt thicker now, every breath a struggle, as if the tunnel itself were trying to crush us. We rounded a corner, and the tunnel widened into another chamber. They wouldn't have seen. It was larger than the others, the ceiling disappearing into darkness. The walls slick with moisture. The floor was uneven, a chaotic patchwork of jagged stone and shallow pools of water. The shard in my hand flared briefly, its glow illuminating the center of the room. There was an altar. This one was different. It was taller, more intricate, its surface covered in carvings that radiated a faint, eerie light. The shapes weren't random. They were deliberate, arranged in patterns that seemed to spiral inward, drawing the eye to a single point at its center. Resting there was another shard, larger than the one I held, its edges sharp and jagged, its surface pulsing faintly like a living thing. Tasha stiffened beside me, her gaze fixed on the altar. "This is it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is what it wants." The whispers in my head grew louder, their tone urgent, insistent. They weren't just guiding me now, they were commanding me. I felt the weight of the shard in my hand, its pulsing glow matching the larger one on the altar. They were connected, I realized, pieces of the same thing, and the altar was the key. "Tasha, stay back," I said, my voice trembling. She didn't move. Ah, Elil. Her eyes were locked on the altar, her face pale and drawn, her breathing shallow. "It's not going to stop," she murmured. Not until it has all of it." The shadows in the corners of the chamber shifted, their forms flickering and twisting like smoke, caught in an invisible wind. They moved closer, slow and deliberate, their presence filling the space with an oppressive weight. The whispers became a roar, a cacophony of voices that drowned out my thoughts, my fear, everything. I stepped toward the altar. The shard in my hand flared, its light growing brighter with every step. The shadows recoiled slightly, their forms writhing, their movements erratic. The larger shard pulsed in response, its glow growing in intensity, as if it were calling to me. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and the moment my hand touched the shard, the room erupted. The carvings on the walls flared to life, their glow blinding, their shapes writhing and twisting like living things. The shadows surged forward, their forms coalescing into towering figures that radiated malice. The whispers became screams, loud and piercing, echoing through the chamber like the wail of something ancient and unforgiving. The shard in my hand fused with the one on the altar, their surfaces melding seamlessly. The light they emitted was unbearable, searing through the darkness, forcing the shadows back. But the light didn't bring safety. It brought something worse. The ground beneath me cracked, jagged lines snaking outward from the altar, and the air grew heavy with the stench of decay. Tasha screamed. I turned to see her on her knees, her hands clutching her head, her body convulsing as if something was tearing her apart from the inside. "And inside." Her eyes met mine, wide and filled with terror. And for a moment, I thought I saw something else behind them, something dark. "Why, envy tools as Alisiu Galo, something hungry. Tasha," I shouted, but she didn't respond. The shadows closed in, circling her, their forms flickering and shifting, their edges sharp and jagged. They didn't attack. They enveloped her, their presence suffocating, their movements slow and deliberate. She screamed again, the sound raw and guttural, and then she fell silent. The altar pulsed violently, the glow from the shard spreading outward, filling the chamber with a sickly, pulsating light. The cracks in the ground widened, revealing something beneath, a swirling void of darkness, its surface rippling like liquid, its depths impossible to comprehend. The whispers returned, louder than ever, their tone triumphant. They weren't guiding me anymore. What's used? They were mocking me. The shadows began to move toward me. I stumbled back, the shard in my hand flaring weakly, its light no longer enough to hold them at bay. My flashlight flickered and died, leaving me in near total darkness, the only light coming from the altar. The shadows loomed closer, their forms towering, their presence overwhelming. I clutched the shard tighter, its surface warm and pulsing, and for the first time, the whispers in my head were clear. They spoke a single word, one that sent a chill through my entire being. Choose. Ga. The void beneath the altar rippled. The shadows surged, and the world around me began to collapse. The word hung in my mind, sharp and inescapable, resonating with the low hum that filled the chamber. Choose. Whoa. It wasn't a command. It was an inevitability. The shadows surrounded me now, closing in like a tightening noose. They didn't need to rush. They knew I had nowhere to go. The shard in my hand pulsed again, its light weaker, faltering as if it too was succumbing to the weight of what lay ahead. Beneath the altar, the void rippled and churned, its surface alive with unseen movement. The air felt heavier with every breath, thick with a sense of expectation. The room itself seemed to wait, holding its breath, watching. Tasha lay motionless, her form barely visible through the writhing shadows. I wanted to reach for her, to pull her back from whatever abyss she'd fallen into. But the space between us was impassable. The darkness wasn't just around her, it was in her, wrapping itself around her like a shroud, sinking into her skin. I could feel it from where I stood, its hunger, its malice, and I knew she was no longer entirely herself. The whispers surged again, louder this time, their voices layered and overlapping until they became a singular, deafening roar. They weren't just in my head anymore. They were in the air, in the stone, in the shard I held. They demanded a choice, a sacrifice. The altar pulsed in response, its carvings glowing brighter, the void beneath it growing more agitated. I looked down at the shard in my hand, its surface still warm, still pulsing faintly, as if it were alive. The edges glinted in the dim light, sharp and jagged, and I understood. This wasn't just a tool. It was a weapon, a key, a means to an end. But what end? The shadows pressed closer, their forms twisting and merging, towering over me like living monuments to despair. Their presence was suffocating, their silence more oppressive than the whispers had ever been. One of them moved closer, its form flickering and unstable, its edges dissolving into the air like smoke. It stopped just short of me, tilting its head in a way that was almost curious. And then it spoke. The voice was low, resonant, vibrating through my chest like the rumble of distant thunder. It didn't use words. It didn't need to. The meaning was clear, imprinted on my mind as if it had always been there. It offered a way out, a choice that would end the torment, the whispers, the shadows. But the price was steep. I had to give them something precious. Oh, something irreplaceable. I thought of Tasha, still lying motionless, her body consumed by the shadows. I thought of Ben, his scream still echoing in my mind, swallowed by the darkness. I thought of everything we had been through, everything we had lost, and I felt the weight of the shard in my hand, heavier than it had any right to be. The void beneath the altar rippled again, more violently this time, as if it too was growing impatient. The shard pulsed in response, its light flickering like a dying flame. The shadows moved closer, their presence pressing against me, suffocating. The whispers returned, not as a roar, but as a gentle murmur, insidious and coaxing. They didn't demand now. They tempted. I stepped forward, my movements slow, deliberate. The shard in my hand felt hot now, almost burning. But I didn't let go. The altar loomed before me, its carvings writhing and shifting, their glow casting distorted shadows across the chamber. The void beneath it churned, its surface alive with unseen shapes, and the whispers urged me on. I placed the shard on the altar. Aim to you may be. The room exploded with light, blinding and searing, forcing me to shield my eyes. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, their voices clashing and colliding, filling the space with a chaotic symphony of sound. The shadows recoiled, their forms writhing and dissolving, their presence retreating from the overwhelming brightness. And then the light dimmed. The chamber was silent, the whispers gone, the shadows reduced to faint, flickering remnants. The shard lay on the altar, its surface cracked and dark, its glow extinguished. The void beneath it was still, its surface smooth and reflective, like a black mirror. For a moment, I thought it was over. But then the ground began to shake. The cracks in the floor widened, jagged lines snaking outward from the altar, and the air grew colder, sharper, filled with the faint metallic tang of something ancient and wrong. The void rippled once more, its surface breaking apart, and from its depths, something began to rise. It was massive, its form indistinct, shifting and flickering like the shadows that had haunted us. It had no face, no features, just an overwhelming presence that filled the chamber, pressing against my mind, my soul. The whispers returned, but they were rent in the air. They were inside me, a constant, inescapable hum that vibrated through every part of me. I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering weakly, its beam barely cutting through the suffocating darkness. Tasha stirred, her movements sluggish, her eyes fluttering open. She looked at me, her gaze filled with confusion and fear, and then her eyes locked onto the thing rising from the void. She screamed. The sound was raw, guttural, filled with a terror I couldn't begin to comprehend. The shadows surged toward her, their forms coalescing, and I moved without thinking. I grabbed her arm, pulling her to her feet, the shard in my other hand flaring weakly. The thing from the void loomed closer, its presence overwhelming, its whispers growing louder, more insistent. We ran. The tunnel stretched endlessly ahead, the air growing colder, the darkness thicker, but we didn't stop. The whispers followed. The shadows pressed close, and behind us, the thing from the void continued to rise. Its presence filled the world, consuming everything, and I knew deep down, that it wouldn't stop. Not until it had taken everything. And as we ran, the shard in my hand pulsed faintly, a weak and dying light, as if reminding me that the choice wasn't over. It had only begun.